Welcome to Season 1, Episode 4 of the Table Podcast. This week, we see parallel stories of Cain and Abel show up further in Scripture. Today, we will be in 1 Samuel visiting the story of Hannah and Peninnah, and you'll hear from Tanner Moore, Brian Froese, David O'Brien, and Garrison Jones. Thanks for joining us at the table.
All right. Hey, guys, welcome back. It's next round of our discussion. We've been talking about the Cain and Abel story together. Pretty famous story in the opening pages of the Bible, and we talked about it at length the last time we were together. Almost looked at it from about every angle you can. It feels like, and then today we're gonna push that story forward into the rest or into another part of the Hebrew Scriptures, into the book of 1 Samuel. But before we get into anything new, let's kind of pause and just reflect on where we've been. Ryan, would you just give us a little recap? I tell you what, before we do that, let's introduce everybody at the table tonight. Okay. We got a new face, and we didn't even do that the first time we were together. So. Let's start off. Garrison, why don't you start off and just kind of introduce yourself, tell us your social security number.
Mother's maiden name.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. So I'm Garrison Jones. I'm on staff here at First Baptist. Grew up here, moved back, and have been back in Seminole for about 6 months. So, super exdated to be a part of this.
Absolutely.
Super cool.
Dude can shoot a 3-pointer too.
Could shoot, not anymore.
Could shoot. Go ahead, David.
David O'Brien. I'm a teacher here in Seminole and also a deacon here at the church, but I'm excited about this too.
Cool.
I wasn't here last time, just listened in, but I'm excited to be part of it.
Good. Ryan, go ahead.
Ryan Froese. Been here most of my life. Went to college and came back because Seminole's a good place to be. And I'm a deacon here at the church as well, and I'm a football coach. And track. So.
Good. I got the same story. Graduated from Seminole High School back, and my name is Tanner Moore, and I've got the privilege of facilitating this conversation tonight. So, all right. Well, Ryan, what are some things that, as we looked at the story of Cain and Abel, give us just a little recap of what we talked about, and maybe something that stood out to you.
Okay. All right. So we talked about how the story began. We read and tried to, change our viewpoint, or I don't know if that's the right way to put that. Maybe what we tried to do is we tried to just read it. And see what stood out to us. And I don't know, we talked about a lot of things. Mm-hmm. It's hard to pick one thing out. I'd say probably what stood out to me the most, or what I got the most from the story, is probably just the idea of not being a bystander to the gospel. That you have a choice to make. And you're either going to breathe life or you're going to breathe death. And it's one or the other, and there's no in between. I think that's probably what I took away the most from last time. So.
Cool. Thanks for sharing that. Garrison, I know you were here last time too. Anything else about that story stand out to you, and what's something that you took away from it? Maybe?
Sure, definitely that aspect of it as well. But I think one thing that I've been thinking about a lot these past few days is how my sacrifice, what I bring to the table, doesn't just affect me. It affects my family, my church, my community, and on and on and on. And so the impact and the influence that you can have positively or negatively, I think is a huge deal from this story that I've been thinking about a lot and reflecting on the past few days. So.
Yeah, cool. And so if you remember in the story, we've got two brothers. The older brother is named Cain. Younger brother is Abel. Abel keeps flocks. Cain is a farmer. And in the course of time, they bring their sacrifice to God, like Garrison's talking about. But God looks on favor, or the Hebrew is God lifts his face towards Abel, who brings choice parts of the firstborn of his flock. But on Cain, God did not look with favor. And so Cain's face was downcast. And God comes to Cain and he basically says, like we talked about, why are you pouting? Why are you mad? And he says, if you do what's right, will you not be accepted? And then he gives him this bit of wisdom that Cain's job is to master the sin that wants to have him. And like we talked about, it really comes down to Cain's choice is going to birth consequences. Either he chooses to do what is good and he produces good fruit, which has consequences for everyone around him. It's blessing for the world. Or he chooses to do what is wrong. He gives into the sin that crouches at his door, and that will birth in the story death. But it's not Cain who pays with his life. It's his brother Abel who pays. And we talked about how Abel pays with his life. Adam and Eve, not just do they lose their son Abel, but Cain is banished, so they lose two sons in this in the story. And we talked about how everyone in Cain's world has to live with the consequences of Cain's choice, right? And that's kind of how that story concludes, is with that call, like you and we're both talking about, that call to, so what sacrifice are you going to bring? And are you making choices that lead to life, or are you making choices that others have to live with that are harming them? And that's really what the story calls us to do. Well, that story doesn't just speak to us. It didn't just speak to us. It spoke to future authors of the Hebrew Bible as well. And so as they write future stories in the Bible, those stories reflect the Cain and Abel story and use a lot of the ideas from the Cain and Abel story. So let's dig into one of these future stories. How about tonight? And we'll look at and I keep saying tonight, if you're listening, it might not be nighttime that you're listening to it. We're recording in the evening, and so I might say that, but if you're listening in the morning, just disregard that. But we're going to be in 1 Samuel right now, in 1 Samuel, and a popular story here. So I just we're just going to read this story together. Really, we're going to look at the first 20. Let's look here through about the first 20 verses of 1 Samuel chapter 1. But before we do that, one more point for us to make here before we dig in. Do you guys enjoy using Wikipedia on the internet?
I love Wikipedia.
You love it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah?
Got in trouble in school a lot. It's not reliable, right?
That's right. Yeah. For our listeners who don't use or understand Wikipedia, David, would you just explain what Wikipedia is?
Wikipedia. So it's been a while since I've used that, but that's sort of been my understanding of it, like being able to type in and get information rather quickly. I can't remember how long it's been around.
Yeah, about as long as the internet is, I think. An online encyclopedia,
That's
right?
Pretty much what it is.
When I was little, my grandparents had a set of Encyclopedia World books. Y'all ever have those or play with those? And they were from 1983, I believe. Well, as this will let you kind of give a window into my mind. One of my favorite things to do when I would go to their house is I would go get an encyclopedia off the shelf and read it. I just like reading, and I really like the letter D because it had dinosaurs in there. So I'm a huge,
there you go.
Yeah, if y'all didn't know, I'm a huge dinosaur nerd. Anyway, I loved read. I would just like go grab an encyclopedia. Well, and it was when I was little. Just a few years ago, my grandmother gave those to me. I hope she doesn't listen to this podcast, but she gave those to me as a Christmas present. All 28 Encyclopedia World books from 1983 because I loved them so much as a kid. Here's the problem: there's still 1983 information in those. So I mean, they're 40 years old in their information, right? Those encyclopedias can't update, but that's not the case with internet encyclopedias, right?
Yeah.
Constantly updating them. They're constantly moving forward, sometimes for the worse, like you pointed out. But most of the time, it's good. Here's what gets me. Have you guys ever just gotten lost on Wikipedia for like, I don't know, maybe people are just not as nerdy as me, but have you ever just...
I read little golden books, Tanner, not encyclopedias.
have you? Well, I won't go there. Have you ever just gotten lost on Wikipedia, clicking on all the little blue links?
Yeah, I've done that before.
A couple of times, yeah.
Yeah. When you look at a Wikipedia page, an online encyclopedia entry, it's just almost the whole screen is blue, right? What do all those links do?
They send you to another Wikipedia page normally.
Yeah. And so if you're reading about an article about World War II, when it talks about Nazi panzer divisions, that word panzer is going to be in blue. Because if you don't know what a panzer tank is, you can click on that little link and it'll take you to a whole new page that's pages long just about that one model of tank, right? And there will be all kinds of blue links on that page. So if you don't know what that type of ammunition is that tank used, you could click on that and it'll take you to a new page. And pretty soon you're reading about unicorns. You started off with World War II. You're just like, you're on a totally different topic, but you just keep on clicking those blue links and it just keeps taking you back to a new page with background information. And you click on it and it takes you back, and you click on a link and it takes you back.
So those of us that are conformists, we do this with YouTube.
Oh,
this is
okay.
how you get into watching videos about how there's a giant ice wall and the Earth is flat.
Kyrie Irving.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden you learn that there's a whole piece of land outside the ice wall that none of us can go to, but all the elites go to.
Okay, so explain, Ryan, not what this conspiracy theory of the land outside the ice wall is, but explain how one gets from just watching a routine YouTube video all the way to this far-fetched stuff. What's that process like?
Well, it's the same thing. There's always videos on the side, and you're like, oh, that looks interesting. Click.
Yep.
And then, oh, that looks interesting. Click. And then all of a sudden, you have no idea where you even began. Yeah. It's the same thing. Just normal people do it on YouTube instead of Wikipedia.
All right. Most people don't read encyclopedias, is what you're telling me. In other words. But all of the videos are somewhat related to the previous video, right? Definitely. So like you start off watching a video about football, and then on the side of the screen, there's a video about grass, because football's played on grass. And you click on that, and then there's a video about some type of land, and then eventually you're looking at the land outside the ice wall.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
And they're all somewhat related to each other.
Yeah. See, and if you knew this, the encyclopedias before like 1953, they talk about the ice wall.
Really? I'm going to move on from this because
there it is.
People are going to stop listening to this. Like,
First Samuel's a real weird book.
Yeah. So if you've made it this far in the podcast, I promise we're going to get somewhere here in our biblical studies. The Bible works similar to YouTube or Wikipedia. There are these words and phrases that get recycled in the pages of the scriptures. And my encouragement to you as a Bible reader, my encouragement for us is when you see those links, click them. Right? Click them, go back. Whenever we see the language of the Cain and Abel story here, click the links, take it back to Genesis. Ask ourselves, what was that about back in Genesis? And how should that enlighten us in the story here of these two women? So here's my challenge for us as we read this story, again, hopefully with fresh eyes like we talked about. I want you to try to just find as many references to the Cain and Abel story, as many words or phrases that were used in that story, or just general ideas that are also present here in this story. And I think what we'll see is that this is almost just a retelling of the Cain and Abel story with a few slight differences and then one major difference at the end, okay? So let's do the first 20 verses. Garrison, would you read those 20 verses for us?
Sure. 1 through 20?
Yep.
Okay, so 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 1 through 20 says, There was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zuphite, from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroam, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. He had two wives. One was called Hannah, and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehas, the two sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion, because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. And because the Lord had closed her womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Elkanah, her husband, would say to her, "Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?" Once, when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the Lord's temple. In bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord. And she made a vow, saying, "O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head." As she kept praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk, and said to her, "How long will you keep on getting drunk? Get rid of your wine." Verse 15, "Not so, my lord," Hannah replied. "I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." Eli answered, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." She said, "May your servant find favor in your eyes." Then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Early the next morning, they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and then went back to their home in Ramah. Elkanah lay with Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, "Because I asked the Lord for him."
All right. Thank you, sir. So let's talk about this story here. What are some places in the story that you saw some links back to Genesis chapter 4?
So I'm thinking verse 8.
Okay.
Why are you downcast or downhearted? I think is what mine says.
Uh-huh.
I thought about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Hebrew phrase there, same Hebrew phrase back in Genesis 4. Why is your face downcast? And so Elkanah's asking Hannah the same question that God asks Cain. And so it's phrased a little different in our translation, but it's the exact same Hebrew word, exact same Hebrew phrase. Yeah. So Hannah's in the same spot as Cain. What else do you see here? What other connections?
I think verse 4 and following, they're giving sacrifices. So we're talking about a theme of sacrifice.
That's right.
So there's some differences, but the theme of sacrifice is still there.
Yeah, Cain and Abel, that story takes place. What's going on? What are the brothers doing?
Sacrificing.
They're bringing their sacrifice. And this story, the setting is, what's the family doing? They're bringing their sacrifice. Okay, so both stories take place at the time of sacrifice for the family. What's the situation with Hannah and her, we'll call her sister in this story? What's going on there?
Well, she's being sort of tormented by her sister.
Right.
And I mean, reading it, does it come across this way to y'all, where it seems like maybe she's doing that to, I mean, it said provoke, I guess, but to, I don't know fully the reasoning there.
Yeah.
But it just.
Yeah, and I think we can speculate a little bit, but at the end of the day, what does Peninnah have that Hannah doesn't? Children.
Yeah.
And so Hannah, would you say that maybe she is comparing herself to Peninnah?
Absolutely.
Peninnah has something that Hannah doesn't have, which is the same situation as Cain and Abel. Abel has something that Cain doesn't have, which is the Lord's favor. After his now, I'm not suggesting Hannah did something wrong here,
Right.
but she's in the same situation.
Yeah.
So let's talk just a little bit about why Elkanah has two wives. And so, when you read it, a lot of times people would say, well, that's just what happened in the ancient days. Not necessarily. If a man has two wives even in Bible days, it's either because he's really greedy and he goes and takes something, and in the Bible, that's not looked upon as a good thing, oftentimes. But on the other hand, it has to do with the preservation of the family. And so it's pretty obvious in the story, which wife does Elkanah love?
Hannah.
Hannah's his favorite.
Yep.
And if Hannah could have kids, Elkanah would give her kids. Right?
Would it be safe to say that it's likely that Hannah was his first wife?
Absolutely.
And that's why he loved her, and he didn't really love his other wife. He just did that because he needed to have kids.
So this is one of those moments where, like we talked about the last time we were together, if you're familiar with the culture of this story, it would just instantly, you would pick up on what was happening.
Yeah.
We don't pick up on it. There are just some unwritten truths here that were just common knowledge in the Hebrew culture that we don't connect with in our culture anymore. Here's how it would have worked. If you understand Hebrew history and you really just the history of the ancient Near East, this is what would be happening. Elkanah loved Hannah, and so he married her. But after several years of marriage, Hannah still has no children. In those days, if a marriage can't produce children, the ancient world always placed that blame on the woman. And now we know through modern science that that's not true, but they didn't have the same scientific knowledge that we have today. And so it was thought of in that way that the woman was cursed by whatever god she worshiped, and she couldn't bear children. Well, you've got a couple of options as a husband here. You could ride it out, but here's the problem in the ancient world. If you just decide, well, we're just not going to have kids. We're talking about a time when if Elkanah catches pneumonia, he'll be dead in a week. There's no antibiotics in his world, right? And so life in the ancient world is so much more fragile than life today. You need people way more than maybe we would understand, because we can go to the hospital and we can get a shot to cure, basically every disease that exists. That doesn't exist in their world. The chances of them, if a famine comes to the if we're in a drought right now, have been in a terrible drought for several years, there's still groceries in the grocery store. That's not happening for Elkanah. If it doesn't rain enough, there's a chance somebody starves in his, if Elkanah dies and leaves Hannah behind, she has no hope, right? And so one of the reasons why it's so important that a marriage produce children is, and really the reason why it's important that the ancient world wanted to produce sons, right? Why they wanted to have sons is because if you had sons, you had a line of protection who could come back and take care of the family. If Elkanah has 3 or 4 sons, and then one day Elkanah gets pneumonia and he dies, he knows that his wife is taken care of because his oldest son will be able to farm the land, and Hannah will be provided for, right? And so if you're an ancient husband and your wife can't have children, here are my options. Number 1, we ride it out. But that's risky, because that could mean doom for both of us one day. And when Elkanah gets too old, who's going to take care of him? Who's going to take care of them in their old age? Or what maybe an immoral man would do, send his wife back to her father divorce her and send her back to her father's house, and then go find a new wife. We get from the story that Elkanah hasn't chosen that route, which means he still wants to take care of Hannah. We could also say probably he loves Hannah, right?
Yeah.
The last option is go marry another wife and hope that she can have kids. And now that's the only chance Hannah has of surviving should tragedy strike the family, is through Peninnah's children taking care of Hannah. You see how that works? Elkanah doesn't marry Peninnah, and if you're an ancient Hebrew reader, you wouldn't need someone to explain this to you.
You would already know.
You would just understand what was going on in the story. You probably have a cousin who's in the same situation if you're an ancient Hebrew reader, and you would go, yeah, I know what's happening in this story, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Would it be safe to assume, I mean, just from verse 5, where it says, but to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her.
Yeah, I think so.
So the opposite of that for the other woman would be, does he love her?
Yeah.
Because that's sort of how it sounds to me. I could be way off, but that's just...
Yeah,
I think so.
Yeah, I
that
think
may be a reason for
good.
her
Yeah.
doing what she's doing
But
to her.
but I mean, if you think about the story of Ruth as well,
Mm-hmm.
that's Peninnah's probably. I mean, she's not happy, but she's fine with it because she's taken care of.
Yeah.
And so
You can see that.
So I think back then a woman would deal with that and live through that, even though her husband may not have loved him. She's taken care of. She has a provider, and she has she has something that
Right.
a woman who's not married doesn't have.
And that could potentially explain some of that provoking.
Yeah.
That's what
Potentially.
so.
I mean, I
Yeah.
think that'd be fair
Yeah.
for us to not completely conclude with the closed hand, but
Obviously.
open-handedly say,
Yeah.
there's
That's
probably some bitterness there.
Yeah.
Even though I have
Absolutely.
kids, look what I have that you don't,
Yep.
because he loves you more, kind of almost a rivalry type.
Yeah.
You
And
know?
that's the word that's used to describe them.
Yeah.
Rivals. Her
Yeah.
rival was
Right.
provoking her. Peninnah is in the family out of necessity,
Yeah.
out of efficiency. Hannah's in the family because of love. So that's why they're in this boat. That means that if you think about it, Hannah is the firstborn. Peninnah is the secondborn. Just like Cain is the firstborn, Abel is the secondborn. So Hannah is playing the role of Cain in the story. You see that?
Yeah.
She plays the role of Cain. If the story were to play out the same way that the Cain and Abel story played out, what would Hannah do in the story?
Kill Peninnah.
After the sacrifice, Hannah would invite Peninnah out into the field, or take her somewhere, rise up and kill her. That's what Cain does in the story.
Yep.
But all of a sudden, the author here throws a twist. And it's always wise to pay attention to these stories whenever you get a twist, right? So before we get to there, though, let's just kind of recap this little piece of the story. Where do we have all of the connections between Hannah, Peninnah, and Cain and Abel? Where do you see the connections?
The sacrifice, the phrase about being downcast. And
Yep.
those are the only two that I could. Is there another that we're missing?
Well,
Just the first and
yeah,
second.
Yeah.
If the first and
Firstborn,
second, firstborn,
secondborn.
secondborn.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, so, and then you've got the younger child, the younger wife has something that the older one wants, but doesn't get.
Yeah.
And so, you've got this situation where Hannah is the firstborn, but she doesn't have the favor that she's seeking the way that Peninnah does. And so Hannah is downcast because she's comparing herself to something Peninnah has, same way that Cain was. And so here goes Hannah on her way to the sacrifice. If you're reading the Hebrew scriptures and you're tracking with the story, you go, I know how this story ends. I can anticipate what's about to happen. They're going to go to the sacrifice. Hannah's going to be bitter. She's going to kill Peninnah. But that's not what happens. Let's pick up right here in verse 11.
11.
Yeah. David, would you read that for us? Read verse 11 through about verse... let's just do verse 11, actually.
All right, just verse 11.
I'm sorry, 10 and 11.
10 and 11, gotcha.
Yeah.
All right, starting in 10. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. 11. And she made a vow, saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head.
All right. Yeah. Real quick, what's that about no razor will ever be used on his head? You guys familiar?
Right.
Yeah,
That's right,
explain
That's
what that is. Yeah.
I know a little bit about it.
Okay. What do you know?
The only thing that I really know is there's just certain rules that a Nazirite has. Can't cut your hair. I don't think you're allowed to drink alcohol.
That's correct.
And then
You can't touch anything dead.
can't touch anything dead.
Yep, that's right. It's just a special vow of commitment to God that says, I'm going to take one extra step of dedication. And so the most famous Nazirite in the Bible is Samson, because he can't cut his hair, but he also can't touch dead things, although he rips the lion apart.
Yeah.
He can't touch alcohol, although he has a Philistine wedding festival. So if Samson breaks all of his Nazirite vows, it comes from Numbers chapter 6 is where we get the vow of the Nazirite. What Hannah is saying is to God is, if you give me a son, I will make him a Nazirite for life. Mm-hmm. Most of the time, a Nazirite vow would not be for life. It would just be for a period of time.
Okay.
Yeah, and so like you could take a Nazirite vow for a few months. You could take a Nazirite vow for a year. In fact, we get in the book of Acts, we see that Paul has taken a Nazirite vow at one point because he cuts his hair before he goes to the temple to worship, and because his vow was completed. Yeah. And so the reason you would grow your hair out is to just demonstrate to everybody, hey, look, I've taken this vow of dedication. I'm growing my hair out. It's to tell everybody else, please don't come near me with your dead stuff, right? But also because if you're going to take a vow to God, you're going to do it in a public way. You don't get to do that in private. If you're going to be extra committed to Yahweh Elohim, you better do it in a way that people notice. And so you had to do something public. And we're off track right here, but it's good to break down all this and really dig into why we have this going on in the text. What is Hannah doing here, though? What's her response to this this provoking of her rival and her face being downcast? How does she behave?
She cries out to God.
Yeah. She comes to God, right, with her trouble. And there is a phrase in here in verse 15. What does Hannah say that she has been doing right there at the end of verse 15? Do you see it?
Pouring out my soul to the Lord.
Yeah, she's pouring out, which I think has a dual meaning. To pour out is what you would do with the drink offering when you made your sacrifice.
Yep.
Hannah's bringing her sacrifice, right? But what is she sacrificing? What is it that she's pouring out?
Her soul.
Her soul.
Yeah, in verse 10, it ends off with, she came to the Lord weeping bitterly.
Yeah.
So she's coming to him with that.
That's right.
And then she's giving it over to him. Mm-hmm. Which, to me, I wouldn't hear last time y'all met, but that's sort of, that's putting him in charge and not the emotion, the feeling, the bitterness, the whatever.
Absolutely. ... Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Hannah brings her sacrifice, but it's not plants, it's not animals. She's offering her very soul back to God in this moment. And do you see what happens in verse 18? She asks for one thing and then she gains something. What does she ask for?
Favor.
Isn't that what Cain was wanting? That's what Cain was upset because Abel found favor. And Hannah brings her sacrifice and asks Eli, the high priest, that she would find favor in his eyes. And he's God's representative. In a way, she's asking the same thing, to find favor in God's eyes. And then what happens to her at the end of verse 18 there?
She eats, and then her face is no longer downcast.
And her face was no longer downcast. Does that ever happen to Cain in his story?
No.
What does Cain pour out?
Blood.
Cain pours out his brother's blood. Hannah pours out her own soul. And she leaves with her face no longer downcast. And we could assume having found favor in God's eyes, right? Let's pause here. Let's sit here for just a moment now and camp out and say, so what did Hannah do that Cain should have done? I think we can ask that here in this story. So what does Hannah do that Cain should have done?
Bargain with God.
Okay, well, you got to explain that. If you're gonna say that, then
I don't know. I read that as bargaining.
okay.
She definitely is. She says, if you'll give me this, I'll dedicate my son, to you for his life.
Yeah, sure.
Which is interesting to me because
That is interesting, isn't it?
yeah.
Yeah, because we're taught that we should not bargain with God, right? Where does that come from? That idea of not bargaining with God. Actually happens a lot in the Bible, doesn't it? Think about Moses going up on the mountain. He bargains pretty hard with
he
God.
absolutely does.
Gets God to change his mind, the book of Exodus says, right? About killing the whole nation. And God says, okay, Moses, we'll do it the way you say. Maybe it's okay to come to God and be real with him and ask him for something different. Maybe that's okay. Yeah? I don't know. What do you guys think about that? It's kind of touchy. What do you think about it?
Kind of touchy.
Yeah.
So let's ask this. Did Cain bargain with God?
I don't know. What do you think? Do you see Cain bargaining in this story?
I mean, I immediately, without looking at it, say no. I don't think so. But I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with you.
I don't think so either. It's
Yeah,
just something to think about.
it is.
Could he have?
Could he have? But at the end, I think back in the Cain story, we see Cain and Abel. Not that we know the reasoning, but there was something wrong with what Cain was doing, because he's told that you got to do this right and you'll find favor. And so here it's a little bit different, because we're not told she's done anything wrong or that her heart's in the wrong place or anything else. So it's a little bit different character.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But it's interesting that both Cain and Hannah, we talk about how sin is trying to capture you.
That's right.
And so they get to the same place and they have to make it to the place of decision. It's time for decision.
Yeah.
And that's where the bargaining starts a little bit, but also I think the posture of the heart was different, as you can see as well.
Yeah.
So. I agree with that, because I think in this one, from what you see Hannah doing, I mean, she's accused of being drunk. She is. So either beside herself or pouring herself out to the Lord, pouring out her soul to the Lord is what she said. So she's accused of being drunk. I don't know fully what that would look like, but I think the heart there is she has a desire, and I think she doesn't feel like it's a bad desire, but she's struggling with it, and she's making that known to the Lord.
Yeah.
Whereas Cain almost comes across as a pouty baby at this point compared to this, because he's like, I'm not good enough. What about me?
Right.
And
That's
it sort of gives like it's a matter of the heart almost that changes your, well, I mean, just think about yourself, like in a conversation or in, you work somewhere, you want to get noticed, you want to do good by people, but maybe no one sees you at your work or something like that.
Right.
Right.
What's wrong with me?
Yeah.
Because, I mean, we all felt something like
absolutely.
that.
Right,
But,
sure.
I mean, it sort of has that kind of
Yeah.
feel to it from Cain's sin.
Yeah.
This sin, I almost feel like, okay, she's justified in what she's doing.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's my opinion.
Yeah.
That's not truth. But I feel like that's the heart is different.
When you think about Ryan mentioned last time, one of the episodes, of how his third grader was bargaining for a phone.
Yeah.
Well, why haven't you given in? Right. She's not ready.
Right.
Right. And so I think that's kind of clearly Cain was not ready
Yeah.
by his actions afterward. And clearly here, Hannah's ready. I'm ready.
Yeah.
Whatever I need, I'm going to dedicate this to you, God.
Yeah.
It's different, you know?
Yeah. I'm reminded of the story of Jacob when he gets his new name Israel. Remember what he does to get the new name Israel?
He wrestles with God.
He wrestles with God all night. Remember that? We keep using the word bargain, and I think that word bargain could have the wrong connotation of what
Yeah.
Hannah's doing.
Yeah.
I don't think that Hannah is coming to God with a posture, like you're saying, of, well, God, I got something that you could want or you could use. So if you'll give me what I want, I'll give
Right.
you. Like, it's not a transaction here. In fact, we're going to see in the next story we look at that Saul's using his sacrifice like a transaction, and it gets him in big trouble. But Hannah's not afraid to wrestle with God, just like Jacob. And remember, after Jacob wrestled with God, God blessed Jacob for holding on all night long and just clinging to him and saying, I'm not letting you go. And in this story, that's what Hannah's doing. She's wrestling. She's wrestling with her anguish. She's wrestling with her grief, but she's not letting it master her.
Right.
She's not surrendering to it. She's wrestling with it.
Yeah.
And she's bringing herself as a sacrifice, right?
Yeah.
Hannah's bringing her own soul as the sacrifice to God.
Yeah.
And what does it earn her?
Favor.
It earns her favor.
But I think you hyperlink this to Jesus Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. You could, in a sense, argue it's the same type of bargaining Jesus does. God, is there no other way for this to happen? Fine, I'll give myself.
It's great. It's
You
a
know,
great
it's a
point.
similar type of bargaining.
Yeah.
Whereas we have a negative connotation of that. It's a similar sense.
Yeah.
And just
Yeah,
pouring out
it's-
yourself to God, saying, God,
Yeah.
I need help, you know?
Yeah.
So
It's the same kind of wrestle.
Right,
Jesus
same
is
kind of wrestle.
wrestling
Right.
with his sorrow and his
Absolutely.
anxiety the same way Hannah's
Absolutely.
wrestling in this story. The same way God wanted Cain to wrestle.
Right.
God wanted Cain to wrestle that sin at his door and master it.
Yep.
But he didn't. He surrendered to it.
So I don't know. Going back to we talking about Cain last time, is there a significance in the fact that God tells him, "Sin's crouching at your door. You can master it, but basically be careful." And there doesn't seem to be a response. Like there's no response.
That's great. That's a
It
great
goes
point.
straight from God telling Cain that to telling his brother, "Hey, let's go out in the field." Like
Yeah.
there doesn't seem to be a wrestling or a response at all.
Yeah.
It almost seems like to me an avoidance. Like I'm not even going to say anything. I know that that's there, but I'm not going to say anything about it. I'm not even going to talk to you about it because it doesn't even say that Cain responds to God.
Yeah.
Like Hannah's responding
Yeah.
because she goes to him and responds, and
Yeah.
he just ignores it.
Yeah.
And the
That's a
next
great
thing
point.
he does is kill his brother.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just
Let's take that and try to make it really practical to kind of wrap this portion of our study up. And that is like, so what does Hannah's behavior mean for me and for you? And how do we take this and maybe even compare it to that idea of Cain avoiding responsibility for being his brother's keeper, but Hannah wrestling with that responsibility. I don't think Hannah wants to be Peninnah's keeper, but she wrestles with that responsibility and gives herself over to God. What does that mean for us at the table, for our listener, to be like Hannah instead of Cain?
I think first off, number one, sin's crouching at every one of our doors as well.
Yeah.
And so you can put yourself in the shoes of Cain and Hannah and Adam and Eve in the very first one, the response here is, God, I need help. I'm crying out to God, giving myself to you. in times of temptation, in times of when I have a chance. Revenge feels natural here. I'm sure it did for her.
Yeah.
I've been hurt. It's natural for us to go get them back, but instead she cries out to God. And so I think that's the first kind of obvious application, is when we're in times of temptation, when we're in times of grief, when we're in times of trouble, we cry out to God and pour ourselves out to God as a sacrifice, saying, God, I don't understand, but I'm yours, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Regardless of the outcome as well.
absolutely.
You know, obviously Jesus, the outcome was what it was.
Yeah.
Even though he's kind of, to, again, use that word bargaining. And I'm sure that Hannah, even if she wouldn't have gotten a son, I assume she would have been in the same boat.
Right.
And this phrase comes to mind that my wife always says all the time, but it's that obedience is greater than the outcome, which I like that phrase. I really like that phrase.
That is really good. I want you to hang on to that in the next time we talk. I want you to come back to it as well.
Okay.
Yeah. But keep going.
Yeah, no, that's what I think about, because to me, she's being obedient to God. She's going through a trial that she didn't ask for.
Yeah.
Because I don't think Cain asked for that either.
Sure.
But she's going through a trial she didn't ask for, and her heart posture is completely different than Cain's is. And I think that's why the outcome is different as well.
It's good.
And Hannah finds favor, and her face is no longer downcast before she even attempts to get pregnant.
Yeah.
Right? That's a blessing that gets tacked on, right? But what's the real blessing in the story? Is that Hannah finds favor with God. Absolutely. That's what Cain is after.
Right. Yeah.
That's what Hannah's really after. Yeah. And that's what she gets. And then she also gets the plus sum, right? She gets the immeasurably more than all we could ask or imagine added on as well.
But the key is that her face is no longer downcast.
I agree.
Because we can get all the things that we ask God or bargain God for, and that's not really going to fulfill us.
That's a great point.
Finding favor with God is where you get that fulfillment and that joy.
Yeah.
That's sort of, I guess, where I would come from too, that last part that you said. It's because there's tons of desires I have that, like, whether it be like job related or like I've got these ideas, that just roll in my head. Maybe it's that the Lord's saying, not right now. Yeah. Or maybe it's, but I still come home at the end of the day, I'm like, golly, why can't I? Why, that why question, or what if we just, and at the end of that, if I were to just do what I wanted to do, it still wouldn't be enough. It wouldn't be that.
Wouldn't fulfill you.
It wouldn't be fulfilling. It wouldn't be near what I thought it would be.
Yeah.
And I see what stands out to me here is there's a person coming before the Lord, and they're broken. And they're letting him know that. They're letting him know, I know I'm broken. This is messing me up. And there's been nights where I've prayed just like that.
Yeah.
But it's humbling, and that's not a place we like to be sometimes.
You're right. We don't like to be there, but I think it's worth pointing out that it's okay for it to be messy.
Yeah.
Right? Like, this is messy for Hannah.
Hannah
is wrestling with the sin that crouches at her door. She's not just like walking on clouds and floating through life and saying, oh God, whatever it is that you have for me, I accept and I love. It's okay to wrestle with the sin, but God wants you to wrestle it.
Yeah.
It's okay to be messy, but God wants you to have your hands dirty. Right? And that's what Cain doesn't do. He doesn't wrestle. He doesn't get his hands dirty. He doesn't sit with that pain and work through it and pour himself out the way Hannah does. And I think for everybody listening, hopefully it can be encouraging that your struggle against sin can be messy.
Yeah.
Right? I know mine has been in my life. I'm sure yours has too. And guess what? That's okay. But wrestle it.
Yeah.
Wrestle it. Right? And then here's the last point that I think will wrap us up here and push us into the next episode, is that when your sacrifice is an extension of your soul, it finds favor with God. Right? Hannah doesn't bring firstborn of her flock. She doesn't bring any physical thing to the sacrifice. She only brings her soul. Maybe that's part of what was missing in Cain's sacrifice. Why Abel's was good and Cain's wasn't. Maybe Abel's sacrifice was simply an extension of his soul in a physical form that he was giving, and Cain's wasn't. I don't know about that, but I do know about Hannah.
Yeah.
Her sacrifice. And so for everybody listening, your sacrifice, when it's an extension of your soul, that's what God's looking for, right? To pour your soul out to him, and he'll bless it.
Thanks for listening to FBC Seminoles, The Table Podcast. A new episode will be released each Monday. We invite you to pull up a chair and join our table each week as we dig into God's Word together. We would love for you to join one of our Connect groups that meets throughout the week and worship with us on Sunday mornings at 9 or 10:30. If you'd like more information, you can call our church office at 432-758-3291 or visit our website at fbcseminole.org.